The biting wind of the high desert gnawed at Alara, even through the coarse burlap hood that suffocated her. It had been days since her world shrank to the scratch of the fabric against her skin, the stench of stale air, and the cacophony of a world she could no longer see. The auction block beneath her bare feet was cold, splinters digging into her soles with each tremor of her exhausted body. Voices, thick with greed and contempt, rose and fell around her, bartering for her flesh as if she were a piece of livestock, stripped of name and history. Her throat was raw from the dust and the screams she had swallowed, the tears long since dried into crusts beneath the sack. A profound, icy despair had settled in her chest, a silent scream that no one heard, least of all the men who saw only a chattel, an unclaimed burden now offered to the lowest bidder. She could feel the stares, feel their estimation of her worth, or lack thereof, pressing down like a physical weight. Her husband, gone. Her home, burned. Her hope, extinguished. This was the final indignity, the end of the line for a woman left with nothing but breath in her lungs and a nameless dread in her heart. A man's voice, rough and guttural, snarled close by. "What's wrong with her? Why the sack?" Laughter followed, cruel and sharp as broken glass. The auctioneer's oily voice, practiced in its deceit, responded, "Lost her wits in the fire, they say. Scarred. Better off not seeing. For her sake and yours Alara flinched, the lie burning her more than any truth. She was not mad, merely broken. And the scars, they were not on her face, but etched deep into her soul, a landscape of ruin. She stood, a silhouette of misery, wishing the ground would open and swallow her whole. The bidding began, a trickle of coins, each clink a hammer blow to her dignity. $5. 6. The numbers were pitiful, a testament to her perceived worthlessness. She heard the clatter of a few more coins, then a different voice, deeper, resonant, cut through the din. It was not boisterous, not greedy, but quiet, almost indifferent. $12. A hush fell.
$12.
For a human life. It was a sum so low it felt like a greater insult than a higher bid. Yet it also carried an odd finality, an end to the agonizing torture of the rising numbers. The auctioneer's gavel struck, a sharp crack that echoed the shattering of what little spirit remained within her. Sold. To the lumberjack, Silas Thorne. The name was unfamiliar. A whisper carried on the wind. She felt a large hand grasp her arm, firm but not unkind. No yank, no shove, just a steady pressure that guided her down from the block. The movement was disorienting, her legs stiff from standing. The man led her through the jeering crowd, their taunts and whispers like stones hurled at her back. She stumbled, and the hand on her arm tightened, preventing her fall. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, a stark contrast to the human stench of the town. She was lifted, surprisingly gently, into what felt like the back of a wagon. The straw rustled beneath her, surprisingly clean. She heard the creak of wheels, the steady plod of horses' hooves. The journey began, away from the prying eyes, the cruel laughter, into the unknown. Silence settled between them, a profound, heavy quiet broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon and the rustle of the sack with each bump in the road. She could feel his presence, a solid, unyielding mass in the driver's seat, but no words were exchanged. She was still a prisoner, but for the first time in days, the air around her felt less tainted by malice. The wagon rattled on for what felt like an eternity, the silence between them a tangible thing, stretching and coiling. Alara's mind, accustomed to the chaos of the auction, now struggled with this profound quiet. She listened to the rustle of Silas Thorne's clothes, the creak of the wagon, the distant call of a hawk. He never spoke, not a single word, not a command, not even a sigh. This absence of sound, after the relentless humiliation, was both a relief and a terrifying void. She had expected demands and immediate assertion of ownership. Instead, there was only the steady progress of the wagon, the man's unyielding presence beside her. When they finally stopped, the air grew colder, the scent of pine stronger, mixed with the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke. She heard him dismount, then his steps approaching. A large hand, the same one that had guided her, reached for her, lifting her from the wagon with surprising ease. She felt the ground beneath her feet, soft with pine needles. He led her a few steps, then opened a door, and she was guided inside. The cabin was small. She could tell from the echo of her own breath, but dry and warm. A fire crackled nearby, sending waves of heat against her legs. She heard him close the door, the latch falling with a soft click. Still no words. He led her to a chair, and she sank onto it, exhausted. A moment later, she heard the scrape of a metal pan, the clink of a plate. Food. He placed a bowl in her hands, warm and substantial. She felt the rich scent of stew rise from it, a primal comfort she hadn't known in weeks. Even with the sack, she knew it was there, offered without expectation. She ate slowly, carefully, her fingers tracing the rim of the rough pottery. It was the first act of simple kindness she had experienced since her world collapsed. She wondered about this man, Silas Thorne. He was not cruel, at least not in the overt ways she had come to expect. His silence was unnerving, yet it lacked malice. Felt like a barrier, but perhaps also a shield. Days bled into weeks. Silas maintained his quiet routine. He rose before dawn, the cabin filling with the scent of coffee and wood smoke. He ate his breakfast, then left, the sharp ring of his axe echoing from the forest. He returned at dusk, laden with logs, and prepared their simple supper. He never touched the sack, never questioned its presence, never demanded she remove it. This silent acknowledgement of her choice, or her fear, was a strange form of respect. Alara, in turn, began to observe him, to learn the rhythms of his solitary life. She learned where he kept his tools, the best way to stack firewood, the subtle shifts in the fire's embers. She began to help, cautiously at first, then with more purpose. She swept the cabin, mended the tear in his worn coat, prepared his coffee before he woke. Her hands, once soft and idle, grew calloused, capable. The sack remained, a symbol of her past, a shield against his unknown reaction. It was a comfort, yet also a growing burden, separating her from the world, from him. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the single window, Silas sat by the fire, sharpening his axe. The rhythmic rasp of stone on steel filled the cabin. Alara, stirring a pot of beans, watched the flames dance in the hearth, feeling the unfamiliar ache of domesticity settle in her bones. The cabin was warm, filled with the scent of their cooking, and the silent, companionable presence of the man across the room. She felt a profound shift within herself. The fear, once a constant companion, had receded, replaced by a nascent curiosity, a quiet longing for connection. She knew this quiet man, this lumberjack who had bought her for $12, was not the monster she had expected. He was a man of the earth, of silent strength and unexpected gentleness. The sack, which had once felt like a necessary protection, now felt like a prison. It was a barrier not just to the outside world, but to the possibility of a different life, a different self. Her fingers went to the coarse fabric, tracing the rough seams. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with the clean scent of pine. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached up and slowly, deliberately, pulled the sack from her head. It fell with a soft thud to the wooden floor. The light, muted by the single window, felt blinding. Silas Thorne paused, his sharpening stone hovering above the axe blade. His gaze, steady and unflinching, met hers. He did not gasp. He did not recoil. He merely looked, his eyes, the color of moss after rain, holding a depth she couldn't yet fathom. The first few moments after the sack came off were suspended in time, thick with unspoken meaning. Alara stood exposed, the raw vulnerability of her face, with its high cheekbones and serious gray eyes, laid bare. She felt the tremor in her hands, the rapid flutter of her heart. But Silas simply looked, his gaze unwavering, devoid of judgment or surprise. He returned to his axe, the rasp of the stone resuming, yet the cabin's atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The silence was no longer a void, but a canvas upon which a new, fragile connection was being sketched. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a broken thing but as a woman. This quiet acceptance was more powerful than any words. In the days that followed, their unspoken agreement deepened. Alara moved with a new sense of purpose, her actions less about survival and more about contribution. She discovered an innate talent for tending the small garden Silas had neglected, coaxing reluctant greens from the stubborn soil. She learned to mend his worn shirts with surprisingly deft stitches, to prepare meals that were both nourishing and surprisingly flavorful from their meager supplies. Her hands, once bound by fear, now found solace in the simple rhythm of work. Silas, in turn, began to communicate in subtle gestures. A nod of approval when she presented a freshly baked loaf of bread. A quiet offering of the best cut of meat at supper. The way his eyes would linger for a moment, an unreadable depth in their depths, before returning to his task. He still spoke little, but his presence became a comforting anchor. Alara found herself watching him, too, the effortless grace with which he handled his axe, his broad shoulders straining as he split logs, the steady, patient way he worked. She learned that his isolation wasn't born of malice, but perhaps a chosen solitude, a preference for the honest company of trees over the fickle nature of men. She found herself sharing fragments of her past, not in long, mournful narratives, but in brief, clipped sentences, prompted by a shared memory or a particular scent. "My mother always said," or "the fire." It took everything. He listened, his silence not empty, but full of attention, a quiet container for her pain. He offered no pity, only presence, and that was precisely what she needed. Their fragile sanctuary, however, was not impenetrable. One biting afternoon, a harsh wind carried not only the scent of snow but also the faint, unmistakable smell of cheap tobacco and unwashed men. Silas, his axe already raised, froze, his head tilted, listening. Alara felt a prickle of unease. He lowered the axe slowly, deliberately, his movements controlled, his eyes scanning the tree line. Then he moved with a sudden, urgent swiftness, ushering her back towards the cabin. "Stay inside," he rumbled, his voice low and gravelly, the first command she had heard from him. His jaw was set, his eyes hard. The air thrummed with a new, dangerous tension. Just as he closed the cabin door, the sound of horses thudding through the undergrowth grew louder, accompanied by crude shouts. A small group of ragged men, their faces etched with greed and malice, burst into the clearing. One of them, a gaunt man with a missing tooth and a cruel sneer, recognized Silas. Well, if it ain't Silas Thorne, the quiet one," he sneered, spitting tobacco juice onto the snow. "Heard you bought yourself a little present at auction, Thorne. Thought we'd pay a visit. See if she's worth the fuss." Alara pressed herself against the cold log wall inside the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was no longer just the woman with the sack. She was herself, visible, vulnerable. And she knew, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that she would not be taken again. The air outside the cabin grew thick with a palpable menace. Alara watched through a crack in the door, her breath catching in her throat. Silas stood before the cabin, his axe held loosely at his side, a silent sentinel against the three men who encroached upon his sanctuary. The gaunt man, his eyes alight with cruel amusement, gestured towards the cabin. "Bring her out, Thorne. A man like you, alone in these woods, doesn't need a broken woman. We'll take her off your hands." Free of charge, Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He said nothing, but his posture, the subtle shift of his weight, conveyed a silent, unyielding threat. The second man, younger and more impulsive, started to move towards the door. It was then that Alara made a decision. She would not be a passive victim again. Her fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now laced with a steely resolve. Grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from beside the stove, she flung the cabin door open, stepping out into the biting cold. "She stays," Alara declared, her voice, though trembling slightly, ringing with a newfound authority. Her eyes met Silas's for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange of understanding and shared resolve. The men paused, surprised by her sudden appearance, their eyes widening at the sight of a woman who was clearly not broken. The gaunt man's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then renewed malice. "Well, looky here," he growled. "The little birds found her voice, and a skillet, too. What's a pretty thing like you doing with a silent lug like him?" Before he could finish, Silas moved. It wasn't a charge, but a fluid, precise motion. The axe, once a tool of industry, became a weapon. He didn't swing to kill, but to maim, to incapacitate, a clear message of his intent. The first man cried out as the blunt side of the axe slammed into his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the snow. The second man, caught off guard, stumbled back, tripping over a tree root. Alara, seeing her chance, swung the heavy skillet, catching the third man in the knee with a resounding clang. He bellowed, clutching his leg. In moments, the clearing, once filled with their swagger, was a tableau of pain and disarray. Silas, breathing heavily, stood over the fallen men, his axe still held, his gaze icy. "Get out," he rasped, his voice low and dangerous. "And don't come back." The men, groaning, scrambled to their feet, fear now replacing their earlier bravado. They hobbled away, disappearing into the dense forest, their jeers replaced by desperate whimpers. The silence that followed was different from any they had known before. It was not a silence of absence, but of shared victory, of a bond forged in fire. Alara stood panting, the skillet still clutched in her hand, her eyes locked with Silas's. His gaze, once unreadable, now held a warmth, a deep, quiet respect that filled the empty spaces within her. He reached out, his calloused hand gently taking the skillet from her grasp, his fingers brushing hers. "You," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You are not broken." It was not a question, but a statement of truth, an affirmation that reverberated through her very being. The tears she had held back for so long finally streamed down her face, not from sorrow, but from a profound sense of release, of being seen, understood, and defended. Weeks later, as the first tender green shoots of spring pushed through the thawing earth, Silas found Alara by the creek, washing clothes. The sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, and her profile, once etched with despair, now held a quiet strength. He approached her, his steps soft on the damp earth. She looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. "Alara," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such care, felt like a revelation. "This life, it's a hard one, but I wouldn't be alone in it. If you'd have me," he offered no grand declarations, no flowery words, only an honest, direct question born of shared hardship and mutual respect. Alara's heart swelled. She saw not the silent, detached lumberjack, but the man who had bought her not for ownership, but for the chance to be free. The man who had given her space, offered her kindness, and stood by her side when darkness called. She saw a quiet dignity, a steadfast loyalty that resonated deeply within her own resilient spirit. She smiled, a true, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "Silas," she replied, her voice steady and clear, "I would." Their marriage was a simple affair, witnessed only by the towering pines and the whispering wind. There was no preacher, no formal vows, just their hands clasped firmly together, their eyes holding a silent promise. They built their life in the clearing not as a transaction but as a partnership. The cabin, once a place of refuge, became a home, filled with the quiet hum of their shared existence. Alara, once auctioned, once silenced, found her voice, not in grand pronouncements, but in the rhythm of her days, in the strength of her hands, and in the unwavering gaze of the man who saw her not for $12, but for her true, immeasurable worth. Her journey from the darkness of a burlap hood to the light of her own making was complete, a testament to the quiet power of resilience, and the transformative strength of an unexpected, profound connection.